This last session of my series about Reacts and what's new in React. Today I'm gonna talk about React's effects hooks. Um, we talked in the previous two sessions about our move from a React component into stateless function. And in this session, we're gonna talk about how we're gonna borrow the life cycles from the React component without extending the React component. And that could be done using something useEffects. So useEffects can give us the opportunity to borrow some functions like component did mount, component did update, and component will and mount. And in order to do that, we're going to take a look at the script and how to write that. For example, as you can see here in this function, which is a stateless function, we are using something called useEffect. And in the useEffect, we are printing just a simple statement, and this function will be called when the component did mount and to be called once. But when we think in general about the life cycle, we know that we have different functions that get called, like component did mount, will unmount, and others. So how to achieve that? Actually, we can achieve that using the useEffects. And it runs every time a component renders. And this runs usually once, but in order to get this function to run every time we change the value, we can do a trick here. For example, in this case, this will run once because we are passing an empty array. But if we want this function to get called when a specific value is updated, we can pass this value here. As for example, here we are passing count, which means that every time the count gets updated, this function will be called. Let's take a look at the code here. For example, this is just a regular React component, and we have this function, component did mount, component will unmount, and component did update. And these are just regular functions that we call on click, and in this function we use a set state to update the count values, whether it's count 1 or count 2. The equivalent of this in the functional component is to borrow the useEffect from the React. And here, as you can see, this will run only once because we are passing an empty array. And this function here, as I told you about the trick, this will get called every time the count changed because we are passing the count to the array. And this function here will get called when the component unmount by returning a function. So when you return the function here, you are calling the useEffect. You are telling the useEffect to get called every time the component unmount. We're gonna run the code now and see npm start. Let's wait for the app to come up, and as you can see here, we have two components here. One of them is a React component and the other one is a functional component. We will run the refresh, and we can see here that component did mount was called, and count has changed. If we look at the code here, in the app, we can see that we are um, having two components. One of them is the React component, and one is the hooks function that comes from here. So the first value component did mount was called when this was updated. So as we can see here, React component is first. So come back here, click on the count, component did update, component did update, component did update, and again, as you can see, this got called. Now let's clear this, and this is the functional component here. If we look back at the code here, we can see that count is um, attached to this useEffect. So every time we change the value of the count, this will be updated. Let's look back at here the console. Count 1, component will unmount, and count has changed. But if we call this one here, we recognize that we only called component will unmount. And in order to trigger this function, when count 2 is updated, we can add it to the array. Now we can go back here, refresh, call count 2, and we can see that count has changed, got printed here because we attached that to the useEffect function. As you can see here, it's very simple, and this function presents the component mount, this presents the component will unmount, and this presents the count has changed. Every time any of these values attached to the function changed, this function will be called. It is very simple, very straightforward. You just import the useEffect here, and you write your function, and the magic will happen. Hope you enjoyed this session with me. I will paste a sample of code and attach it to the description in the session. Please let me know if you have any question. Thank you so much.